I never thought my life would feel like a soap opera, but there I was, standing in the middle of my childhood living room, tears streaming down my face, clutching a coffee cup like it was a lifeline. If you'd told me 6 months ago I'd be back in Ohio, living with my dad at 38 years old, I would have laughed. Or cried. Probably both. But life doesn't ask for permission when it turns your world upside down. It just does. My name's Claire. I grew up in a small town called Maple Ridge, where the biggest excitement was when Dairy Queen reopened every spring. I left as soon as I could, moving to Chicago for college and then building a life in New York. I had a career in publishing, a condo with a skyline view, and a fiancé, Ryan, who seemed too good to be true. Spoiler alert, he was. Last fall, I found out Ryan had been finding himself in all the wrong places, including the arms of our mutual friend Jenna. It wasn't the affair itself that broke me, it was the web of lies. The gaslighting. The way he made me feel like I was crazy for suspecting anything in the first place. When it all came crashing down, I packed a suitcase, handed him the keys, and took a one-way flight to Cleveland. My dad picked me up at the airport in his old pickup truck, his face a mixture of relief and concern. "Welcome home, kiddo," he said, squeezing my shoulder. Living with my dad was an adjustment. He's a retired high school football coach, the kind of guy who believes in 3 things: morning coffee, the Cleveland Browns, and the sanctity of small-town gossip. Our house was still frozen in time, complete with floral wallpaper and a couch that smelled vaguely of mothballs. And then there was my sister, Melissa. She lived 3 streets over with her husband, Tom, and their 3 kids. Melissa had stayed in Maple Ridge her whole life, raising her family in the same house we grew up in. She was the golden child, PTA president, Sunday school teacher, the kind of woman who could bake cookies for a bake sale and still show up to spin class at 6 a.m. sharp. We'd never been close. Growing up, we fought like cats and dogs, and adulthood hadn't done much to fix that. She thought I was selfish for leaving, and I thought she was suffocating herself in this tiny town. But now that I was back, we were stuck with each other. Melissa showed up the day after I moved in, armed with a casserole and unsolicited advice. "Claire, you should join the church book club," she said, her voice dripping with faux enthusiasm. "It'll be good for you to meet people." "I'm not really in a book club kind of mood," I said, forcing a smile. She sighed, her eyes scanning me like I was a project she couldn't quite figure out. "You can't just hide out here forever, you know. Watch me." The weeks turned into months, and I started to settle into a strange rhythm. I worked remotely, editing manuscripts during the day and helping my dad with house projects in the evenings. It was the first time in years I'd slowed down enough to notice the little things, like how the sunset turned the maple trees outside orange and gold, or how my dad hummed old country songs while fixing things in the garage. But the real turning point came in late December, when my dad fell off a ladder while trying to hang Christmas lights. Melissa called me in a panic, and I rushed to the hospital, my heart pounding like a drum. Seeing him in that hospital bed, looking smaller than I'd ever seen him, something inside me cracked. The doctors said he'd be okay, but he needed rest. That meant no more ladder climbing or snow shoveling or "I'm fine, don't fuss over me" speeches. Melissa and I divided up the responsibilities, and for the first time in years, we started talking. Really talking. One night, after the kids were in bed, she poured us both a glass of wine and asked, "Why did you stay away so long?" I stared into my glass, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "I guess I always felt like I didn't belong here. Like I had to prove I was more than just some small-town girl." Melissa looked at me, her expression softer than I expected. "You know, I always envied you. You got out. You had adventures. I stayed here because I was too scared to leave." Her words hit me like a freight train. All this time, I'd assumed she judged me for leaving, but maybe she'd just been projecting her own fears. Maybe we both had. By spring, things started to shift. Melissa and I grew closer, bonding over late-night conversations and shared memories. I joined the book club, despite my initial resistance, and found a surprising sense of community among the women there. I even started dating again, though I kept it casual. No more Ryan-level disasters, thank you very much. My dad recovered slowly but surely, and we spent hours in the garden, planting tomatoes and arguing about the best way to make spaghetti sauce. For the first time in a long time, I felt grounded. Like I didn't have to run anymore. The last big moment came on a warm May afternoon, at a family barbecue in Melissa's backyard. My niece, Emma, tugged on my sleeve and said, "Aunt Claire, are you staying here forever?" I smiled and ruffled her hair. "I don't know about forever, kiddo. But for now? Yeah, I think I am." Melissa caught my eye from across the yard and raised her glass in a silent toast. I raised mine back, feeling a surge of gratitude. For my family. For this messy, imperfect, wonderful life. For the chance to start over. Sometimes, life doesn't go the way you planned. Sometimes, it's even better. The summer crept in with the smell of freshly cut grass and the sound of cicadas humming in the evening air. Life in Maple Ridge had a way of settling into your bones if you let it. By then, I'd stopped counting the days since I left New York. Something about that felt like progress. Dad was doing better, although he still liked to grumble about how we hovered too much. Melissa was the worst offender, insisting he use the walker the doctor prescribed. He hated the thing and only used it when he thought we were watching. I caught him sneaking to the garage one evening without it and scolded him like he was one of Melissa's kids. "Old habits die hard, Claire," he said, winking as he shuffled back to the living room. I laughed, shaking my head. That was Dad, stubborn as the day is long. But I couldn't blame him. After losing Mom a few years back, he'd gotten used to doing everything himself. I think letting us help him felt like admitting he wasn't invincible. By July, I'd settled into the book club so well that I couldn't believe I'd resisted it. It wasn't just about books, though I did enjoy the monthly debates over whether the protagonist was a misunderstood genius or just a jerk. It was about the women. They were a mix of ages, from moms like Melissa to retirees like our neighbor Betty, who had a sharp wit and a penchant for gossip. Betty took a particular interest in my love life, or lack thereof. "So, Claire," she said one evening, leaning across the table with a conspiratorial grin. "I hear you've been seeing that nice young man who works at the hardware store." My cheeks flushed. "His name's Mike, and it's not serious." Betty wagged a finger at me. "Not serious, my foot. He's been fixing up that old bike of yours for weeks." "That's not serious. That's courting." The group erupted into laughter, and I couldn't help but smile. Mike was sweet, tall and broad-shouldered, with a quiet confidence that made him easy to talk to. He'd asked me out after I brought Dad's broken lawnmower to the shop, and while I wasn't sure I was ready for anything serious, I found myself looking forward to our dates. Meanwhile, things with Melissa continued to surprise me. One night, as we sat on her porch after the kids had gone to bed, she admitted something I'd never expected to hear. "Tom and I almost divorced last year," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I stared at her, stunned. "What? Why didn't you tell me?" She shrugged, picking at the edge of her wine glass. "You weren't here. And I didn't want anyone to know." It felt embarrassing. "Melissa, you have nothing to be embarrassed about," I said, reaching for her hand. "Marriage is hard. Life is hard." She nodded, her eyes glistening. "We're okay now. But it took a lot of work. And for a while, I thought I'd made a huge mistake staying here." Her words echoed the conversation we'd had months earlier, when she confessed her fears about never leaving Maple Ridge. It hit me then how much I'd underestimated her. Melissa wasn't just the perfect PTA mom I'd always made her out to be. She was human, messy and complex, just like me. As the summer faded into fall, I started to think more seriously about my future. The condo in New York was still technically mine, Ryan had moved out, and the lease would be up soon. My boss was pushing for me to come back to the city, but the thought of returning to that life made my chest tighten. One crisp September morning, I went for a walk to clear my head. The leaves were just starting to turn, and the air smelled like wood smoke and damp earth. I found myself wandering to the little park where I used to play as a kid. Sitting on an old swing, I closed my eyes and let the memories wash over me. When I opened them, I saw Mike walking toward me, a lopsided grin on his face. "Fancy meeting you here," he said, sitting on the swing next to mine. We talked for hours, about everything and nothing. He told me about his dreams of opening his own shop someday, and I told him about my crossroads. "Sounds like you've got some big decisions to make," he said, his eyes warm and steady. "But you don't have to make them alone." By the time winter rolled around again, I'd made up my mind. I gave up the condo, transitioned to freelancing full-time, and started looking for a little house of my own in Maple Ridge. It wasn't an easy decision, but it felt right. Melissa cried when I told her. "I always hoped you'd come back, but I didn't want to push you," she said, hugging me tightly. Even Dad got emotional, though he covered it up with a joke about how he'd have to put up with me stealing his coffee now. As for Mike, well, let's just say Betty wasn't entirely wrong about the whole courting thing. We took it slow, but there was something solid and steady about him that I couldn't ignore. For the first time in years, I felt like I was building something real. Life isn't perfect, and I don't expect it to be. There are still moments when I miss the buzz of the city, or when I wonder what might have been if I'd taken a different path. But those moments are fleeting. Because here, in this tiny town with its gossip and book clubs and football Fridays, I found something I didn't even know I was looking for, a sense of belonging. Sometimes, letting go isn't about giving up. It's about making space for something new. The first snow of December came early that year. I woke up to a blanket of white covering the front yard and the sound of Dad humming in the kitchen. The house smelled like coffee and cinnamon, and for a moment, I felt like I was a kid again, waking up to my mom's homemade cinnamon rolls. The ache of her absence was still there, but it didn't feel as sharp anymore. It felt like a part of life, a thread woven into the fabric of who I was. By the time Christmas rolled around, life in Maple Ridge had settled into something I could only describe as peaceful. Melissa and I had planned the holiday dinner together, and for the first time in years, I actually looked forward to it. Her kids were buzzing with excitement, counting down the days to Santa's arrival, and Dad was in his element, setting up a train set he'd bought for the grandkids. Mike was there, too, quietly helping Dad with the assembly and making me laugh with his dry humor. He fit in so seamlessly with my family that I had to pinch myself sometimes. After all the chaos I'd been through, I couldn't believe how easy it felt to just be with him. The night before Christmas, after the kids had gone to bed and Melissa and Tom had gone home, I sat with Dad by the fire. He was nursing a glass of whiskey, his favorite mug sitting on the coffee table next to him. The tree lights reflected in his glasses, and for a moment, he looked lost in thought. "You've done good, Claire," he said suddenly, breaking the silence. I looked at him, confused. "What do you mean? Coming back here? Facing all of this? I know it wasn't easy for you, but you've made this place feel alive again. For all of us." I blinked back tears, not sure how to respond. My dad wasn't one for big emotional speeches, so when he said something like that, you knew it mattered. "Thanks, Dad," I said softly. "That means a lot." He smiled, lifting his glass in a little toast. To new beginnings. Christmas Day was a blur of laughter, wrapping paper, and Melissa's infamous peppermint pie. The kids tore through their presents like little tornadoes, and Dad sat in his recliner, watching them with a grin that could have lit up the entire room. Mike surprised me with a small, beautifully wrapped box. Inside was a necklace with a tiny silver maple leaf charm. "For Maple Ridge," he said, his voice low so no one else could hear. "For coming back. For staying." I looked up at him, my heart full to the brim. "I'm not going anywhere," I said, and I meant it. That night, after everyone had gone home and the house was quiet again, I stood outside on the porch, looking up at the stars. The air was cold and still, the kind of night where you could hear the crunch of snow from a block away. For the first time in years, I felt like I wasn't chasing something just out of reach. I wasn't running away, either. I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Life wasn't perfect, but it was real. And it was mine. Sometimes, the hardest thing to do is stop searching for what you think you want and start embracing what you already have. For me, it took losing everything to find my way back home. But standing there under the starry Ohio sky, I knew one thing for sure. Home wasn't just a place. It was family. It was love. It was the life I was finally ready to live. And I couldn't wait to see where it would take me next. The end.